You have the floor.
Okay. Thank you very much for the invitation and for coming here, and good morning.
Bom dia a todos.
Now there's a translation coming through. Okay, so the topic for today is the problem of dogmatism, and it's connected or the same issue with a different name is falsification through simplification. But I'll talk about this. They're not exactly the same thing. But so I'll start by saying something briefly about how the problem of dogmatism arises. Wittgenstein talks about it in the philosophical investigations in relationship to the Tractatus, but in general, the problem or the risk of dogmatism arises in connection with the kind of exceptionless or universal philosophical thesis. So a philosophical claim typically has the form that it makes a statement about necessity, about what all cases are or have to be in order to qualify as something like that the moral action, that the morality of an action always depends on the motive, for instance, Kant would say. And similarly in the Tractatus, Wittgenstein has an account of propositions as true or false representations. Every possible proposition or every sensible proposition is a true or false representation of a state of affairs. And the problem of dogmatism then is the problem that, okay, so when we make this kind of claims, we might easily do injustice to the complexity of the phenomena or the richness of the cases. So we end up simplifying in a misleading or falsifying way. And this is what Wittgenstein says about the Tractatus. He says later that, okay, so the Tractatus' account of language and logic did capture some aspects of language use, but or some aspects of the behavior of the logical constants. He speaks about these things in the very early 30s when he starts revising his views. So he doesn't say that the Tractatus' account is wrong. He doesn't reject it. I'm going to explain this better. He doesn't reject it. Rather, he thinks about the role or the function of the philosophical account. And I think this is really important in the sense that Wittgenstein's method, I think, it's not a rejection of traditional philosophical thesis. Rather, Wittgenstein is saying, hold on, let's modify the use of these claims that we make in philosophy so that we can achieve the purpose of philosophy. Namely, I take it that in philosophy we're trying to understand something. We have some objects of investigation, language, moral action, whatever. I'm speaking about moral actions because I'm in the process of completing a book on ethics, but so that's in my mind all the time. But so we try to understand some objects of our investigation, whatever they are. For that purpose, we put forward philosophical claims and philosophical accounts. Wittgenstein says that he's rejecting philosophical theses, but I think that means something very specific. It means starting to make a new kind of use of the old thesis rather than saying, for instance, and this is sometimes how Wittgenstein is understood, that, okay, we'll start doing something else. For instance, we don't put forward any positive accounts, but that we just show that people talk nonsense. I think that would be a problematic view, because then I don't think that we achieve an understanding of something simply by realizing our mistakes. There has to be some sort of way of thinking about the phenomenon. And I guess this is the traditional role of philosophy anyway, that philosophy articulates ways of thinking about something. When we don't know there's some complex phenomenon and we don't know how to think about it, philosophy is the first one to come to the scene and say, here's a way to think about it. And then when that way of thinking about actually starts working, then maybe we have a science based on that way of thinking. But philosophy always articulates this kind of ways of thinking about things. And I think that's very important. Okay, so the problem of dogmatism then is the problem that by making these exceptionless philosophical claims, I'm just using the word exceptionless for universal because it's clearer what exceptionless means. It means that it has to account for every possible instance of a relevant kind. So philosophy makes that kind of thesis, and it risks dogmatism, and it risks falsely simplifying things. I think simplification, and this is another thing, simplification is really important for philosophy. Simplifying sometimes helps to see things more clearly. It helps to bring into focus some aspects of complex phenomena. So that's important, and philosophical theories, since forever, they always simplify and abstract. And actually, so I'll just say some terminological thing. I might be talking about idealization and abstraction. They are two different modes of simplification. So idealization is when we make things more regular and sort of nice and neat and clean. We simplify things in that way by making them more regular. Abstraction is about leaving out some of their features. So this is how I will use these terms. I'm not saying that this is the only way to use those terms, but that's and philosophical theories always do that. But then the problem is they often end up falsifying, simplifying in such a way that actually then this gives rise to problems. For instance, you might ask, I mean, I'm sure that Kant is right that the motive of an action sometimes and often makes a difference to its moral value. But does the moral value only always depend on the motive? I don't think so. Or anyway, I think things are a bit more complicated than that. Is proposition always a true or false representation? Or rather, is every sensible instance of language use a true or false representation or a part of true or false representation, like a name? I think that's a bit simplistic too. So that's how the problem of dogmatism arises, and it's not so in the cases when Wittgenstein criticizes the Tractatus, for instance, for having been dogmatic and having simplified things in a misleading way. I don't think that his solution to that problem is to develop a different account of language. For instance, let's say that so sometimes the later Wittgenstein is thought to be having an account of language as necessarily rule governed, or language as consisting of language games. But if we make the claim that every meaningful instance of language is rule governed, then we face exactly the same problem. We're making the same kind of claim, exceptionless claim, about all the cases, and the problem of dogmatism arises here again. And Wittgenstein, of course, discusses many cases in the later philosophy that are not really accountable in terms of this account of language as being rule governed. So the question is, so the solution to the problem with the Tractatus, or the problem of dogmatism with the Tractatus, is not then merely to develop a different account of language. It involves rethinking the kind of claims that we make in philosophy. And that's where I now come to the first quotation in the handout, if you have it. So that's a quotation from the Investigations, and I guess I might just read it. So Wittgenstein says, our clear and simple language games are not preliminary studies for the future regimentation of language, as it were, first approximations ignoring friction and air resistance. Rather, language games stand as objects of comparison which through similarities and dissimilarities are meant to throw light on the features of language. For we can avoid the unfairness or vacuity in our assertions only by presenting the model as what it is, as an object of comparison, as a sort of yardstick, not as a preconception to which reality must correspond. And then he says the dogmatism into which we fall so easily doing philosophy. So this is to say that we have to rethink about the role of our philosophical accounts. And you could say that Wittgenstein is kind of saying here, or in relation to the Tractatus, you might describe his thinking like saying, oh yeah, I had a model of language in the Tractatus, but I claim that all instances of language use correspond to this model and went wrong. Instead, in order to clarify language use, the Tractatus' model may be useful for those purposes too, but we must not impose it on language or claim that every possible instance of meaningful language use will correspond to this model. Rather, we compare actual language use with the Tractarian calculus, and then we need to observe, like he says in the quotation that I just read, we need to observe not only the similarities, but also how some uses of language differ from that model. And that's really important because it can also help you to understand your objects of investigation, to see how they differ from some clearly articulated model in some specific ways. Because what you want to understand is, for instance, how different kinds of uses of language function or work. And if some language use differs from your model in some specific way, well, hey, that helps you to understand that. Also, that case that does not correspond to the model. So this is really important, that the philosophical models are, let's say, an instrument of thought, like a philosophical theory. I think, philosophical theory, and, I'm a very down-to-earth person by character. So I like to think in simple terms and not in some fancy metaphysical terms. But what we know for certain is that philosophers have articulated philosophical theories, right? And philosophical theories philosophical theories are some sort of an instrument of thought by means of which we try to understand whatever we're trying to understand in philosophy. And then certain uses of these instruments lead us into trouble. Wittgenstein is saying, yeah, we have to revise or modify how we use these accounts, like the Tractarian account of language, so that we can understand what we're trying to understand and avoid the problems that arise from falsely simplifying things. So I think that's kind of a basic idea there. And so okay, so if I'm now claiming that Wittgenstein is saying, okay, so in philosophy we use, or like he says in the investigations 130 and 31, that we have to understand our philosophical accounts as models. His example there is, he mentions as an example, our clear and simple language games. There are earlier versions of these remarks where he talks about exact language games. He has various candidates for that. But I think what the simple language games there are simply an example of one kind of model. There are other models in Wittgenstein, for instance, grammatical rules. You might try to describe uses of language by stating rules for it. But if you claim that language, then all the relevant uses of language correspond to that rule, and that it really captures those uses, all of them, say the uses of goodness, you again risk dogmatism and false simplification. So these different kinds of kind of tools of thought that Wittgenstein has: simple language games, grammatical rules, examples of other kinds of examples of cases, and also logical calculuses. You can understand the logical calculus as a language game. Logical calculus is a language game according to exact and definite rules. That's how Wittgenstein speaks about them later. There's special kind of language game. That kind of calculus is also can be used to clarify specific aspects of language. But if we claim that language corresponds to some calculus of like that, like Wittgenstein did in the Tractatus, then we again fall into this problem of dogmatism and false simplification. So in Wittgenstein, we find many different kinds of models: language games, grammatical rules, all kinds of examples, made up examples and real examples, and so on. And all of these models, I think he means, are to be used in this way. We are to use them as models with which we compare, for both similarity and difference, our objects of investigation. And in that way, we can bring into view various aspects of those objects of investigation in order to clarify them, to bring them into clear focus. And so in the handout, I have, there is the second quotation there is really comment on Moreno, because I was, there was a suggestion that I would relate to what I say to that. Maybe I'll come back to that later. But now the quotation that starts with, when you are tempted to make general metaphysical statements, ask yourself always. That kind of summarizes, in a way, the train of thought that I've been trying to sketch here. So Wittgenstein says, when you're tempted to make general metaphysical statements, ask yourself, what cases am I actually thinking of? What sort of case, which conception do I have in mind here? Now, something in us resists this question, for we seem to jeopardize the ideal through it, whereas we are doing it only in order to put it in the place where it belongs. This is connected with him discussing the Tractatus account of language in this connection. And then he says about and this can be understood as, the last sentence, two sentences can be understood as concerning the Tractatus' model for language. So for it, the Tractatus' model for language is supposed to be a picture with which we compare reality, through which we represent how things are, not a picture by which we falsify reality. And here is the thing. So a philosophical account, like the Tractatus' account of language, gives you a way of thinking about the objects of investigation. It's meant to, it's some sort of mode of representing the objects of study that is meant to help you to understand what they're like. And that's the purpose of a philosophical theory. It's an instrument of thought in that sense. But if we impose that model onto reality or onto our objects of investigation, and we claim that they always have to fit this model, then the risk of dogmatism arises. But the model is something that we meant to use for understanding how things are, or for representing how they are, not for falsifying how things are. So I think that's a nice remark in that respect. But the next one in the handout is my favorite. That's from the early 30s, from 33 or 34. And I think it explains really nicely Wittgenstein's idea of what to do with grammatical rules, for instance. So he says, that's the remark at the bottom of page 1 of the handout. So he says, if we look at the actual use of a word, what we see is constantly fluctuating. Okay, language use is complicated and it's completely constantly changing. In our investigations, we set over against this fluctuation something more fixed, just as one paints a stationary picture of the constantly altering face of a landscape. Yeah, no, no painting can capture, how the landscape is changing. It has to capture something characteristic of that landscape. But the landscape might be very different in different weather. When it's raining, when it's windy, and when it's sunny, it might look quite different. So the landscape painting had to capture something characteristic of it. Then I keep reading. When we study language, we envisage it as a game with fixed rule. We compare it with and measure it against a game of that kind. If for our purposes we wish to regulate the use of a word by definite rules, then alongside its fluctuating use, we set up a different use by codifying one of its characteristic aspects. So our rules, the grammatical rules, are meant to codify specific aspects of the language use, and then we clarify actual fluctuating language use by comparing the actual complicated and fluctuating uses with those simpler models, grammatical rules, in order to capture and clarify particular aspects of the actual use. And then Wittgenstein gives an example. Thus, it could be said of the word good in an ethical sense, that the word good in an ethical sense is a combination of a very large number of interrelated games, each of which, as it were, a facet of the use. What makes a single concept here is precisely the connection, the relationship between these facets. And then he goes on to something that he also discusses in the next quotation, which is Philosophical Investigations 81, but I'll come to that later. Because that relates to there's a comparison between Wittgenstein and distinguishes idealization in philosophy from idealization in science. So that might be something useful to discuss too. But so maybe I'll come to that point later. But I hope that quotation from one of his manuscripts in the early 30s, 140, or it's also in the Philosophical Grammar, that I think explains very clearly the Wittgensteinian method, that we might state rules for the use of language in order to clarify its feature, but we're not to claim that language use really corresponds to those rules, but the rules constitute a model with which we compare the actual use, and in that way we can capture some of its aspects and achieve clarity about it. So this is then how we can simplify without falsifying, in the sense that you can use a model, for instance, a model of say meaning is use. Wittgenstein says this applies to many cases, but not all cases of meaningful use of language in the investigations. So I think that we can take that as an example of a grammatical rule, and it's a very important one. But it's nevertheless not a thesis about what meaning really is. And if we read Wittgenstein in that way, then we also make him inconsistent, because he's not supposed to have thesis. So meaning as use, I think that's another example of a Wittgensteinian model. And then we can look at language use in the light of that model, and it can help us to understand what's going on there. But the important thing about simplifying without falsifying is that and now I also come to the point about how idealization in Wittgenstein's sense differs from science, which is something that he speaks about in some of the quotations in the handout, including Philosophical Investigations 81. So the important thing is that when we're discussing philosophical problems, we're always discussing some specific problems in some historical situation. The problems that we're discussing, like what is moral goodness, might have been discussed by Plato and Socrates and others a long time ago. But nevertheless, these are historical questions which we might, in our situation, ask with slightly different motivations than Socrates and Aristotle did, for instance, or Kant did. So we have always our specific versions, let's say, of those problems. Now, a philosophical clarification, then, it might be, in order to clarify some issue in response to philosophical problems, it's possible to simplify as long as the simplified account captures whatever is relevant for addressing the philosophical problems. And that's important in the sense that if everything that is relevant for understanding what I'm trying to understand and dealing with my philosophical problems, the problems that I have in mind, maybe 10 problems relating to moral goodness, or say, I've just been going through my chapter about moral judgments. That chapter about moral judgments in my new book is a response to specific problems in metaethics. And the model that's meant to be a Wittgensteinian model is satisfactory if it does help to deal with those problems. But what the model has to do in order to deal with those problems is that it has to capture whatever is relevant for dealing with those problems. And here the important point is that there is no kind of abstract criterion of completeness for a philosophical account, in the sense that it maybe this is kind of how traditional philosophers have sometimes thought about the notion of essence. That essence is, when you know the essence of something, then you know everything about that thing. If you understand the essence, then you can answer every question that you might have about that. But so Wittgenstein does not have accounts of essence in that sense. I think it's better to speak anyway about what might be essential about an issue in relation to some problem. And the clarification has to capture whatever is essential for dealing with those problems. But the criterion for the completeness of the philosophical account depends on what exactly those problems are. And we can't say, Wittgenstein rejects the kind of account of completeness in philosophy that according to which a philosophical account is complete when we are able to answer every possible question about the issue. This is connected with the Tractatus' account of complete analysis. The complete analysis was meant to be a thing that when you have the complete analysis, then all the possible mistakes about the issue have been somehow all the possible confusions about the issue have been excluded or answered somehow. But there is no set of every possible philosophical problem relating to some specific topic, say, like moral goodness. There's lots of problems about moral goodness, and new problems arise for us in historical situations. Development of technology creates new problems, philosophical problems also. But there is no such thing as saying as a class of every possible problem relating to moral goodness, for instance. Because we don't know what that class of every possible problem would constitute. And the thing is, the important point is that we can always come up with new problems relating to an issue. Only the imagination is the limit. So there's no determinate sense for the idea of every possible problem. And therefore, there's also no philosophical account that can answer every possible problem about some issue. Like maybe the traditional conception of essence somehow was meant to contain everything that you need to know about some issue. If you have the essence, then you have everything. But so here is a difference, I think, to how Wittgenstein thinks. We're always addressing specific problems, particular problems, and the completeness of our account and the completeness of the clarification. And when we say, okay, yet now this clarification is satisfactory, that depends on the specific problems and unclarities that we had. And philosophy in this sense is a kind of responsive thing, and it will never get completely established. So there will never be a philosophical doctrine that could somehow completely explain every possible issue about something like moral goodness. Because what every possible issue about something is, that's just indeterminate. And so it relates to these kinds of issues that Wittgenstein goes into that kind of issues when he then, in the quotation that I read last from the Philosophical Grammar or manuscript 140, when he starts talking about at the bottom, the last paragraph, but it isn't like the way physics gives a simplified description of a natural phenomenon, abstracting from secondary factors. And he talks about the same sort of issues in Philosophical Investigations 81, where he says, first says that we can't claim that language is a calculus, but we often compare languages with calculuses in philosophy or logic. And indeed we do. People still do that. And that I think is not something that Wittgenstein would reject. Rather, logical calculuses, for instance, now for the later Wittgenstein, they are specific kind of clarificatory model. We can use them, but we go wrong if we claim that language really is a calculus. We can compare language, natural language, with a calculus, and we can clarify some of its aspects in that way. But that's very different from claiming that language really is a calculus. If we say that language really is a calculus, then we are falling into making a dogmatic claim and thesis again. Instead, we should compare. The calculus is our model with which we compare actual language use for both similarity and difference. And the same with simple language games. There are examples of language use that are meant to highlight specific aspects of language use in order to bring them into focus. But they're not meant to give some sort of exhaustive account of those uses. It's like that quotation, my favorite one, kind of says that about fluctuating language use and then comparing it with something simpler and I guess static. You know, a painting is static, a static picture of a changing landscape. A rule is something static with the help of which we can try to capture some important aspects of the fluctuating language use. And the difference to simplification in physics is that in philosophy, we can't say that we will eventually, like, this might be also a slightly naive account of what physics does. But so the picture that, or the comparison distinction that Wittgenstein draws between idealization in physics and idealization in philosophy is that in physics, it might make sense to say, okay, well, we'll first idealize or abstract, we'd say Galileo was trying to understand the develop laws for the falling objects. So he left air resistance out of the thing in order to be able to develop the mathematics for that purpose. But later on, you know, the physical account needs to bring back in all these complexities like air resistance so that it can give account for how things actually fall, not just in some idealized situation where there is no air resistance. And so the contrast between idealization in science and philosophy for Wittgenstein is that whilst it does make sense to speak in physics of kind of completing the account gradually, that okay, so first we took off air resistance from the picture to develop the equations for the falling objects like Galileo did, and then we bring back the complexities in, and we factor in the air resistance and all those things. But that's the thing that we can't do in philosophy, because there is no every factor that has to be brought back in. Because what problems and clarities we have about an issue, that depends on our philosophical problems, but there is no complete list of philosophical problems. So that's why when we idealize in philosophy, it's always in relation to specific problems and so on. So then we can avoid falsifying things if we cover everything that is relevant for answering and dealing with our philosophical problems. So idealization and abstraction, simplification in philosophy is relative to the purposes of the account, in that sense that it's a response to specific issues that we are unclear about. So that's the point. I think I will not go into the details. I mean, investigations 81 is quite a difficult remark. It is helpful to connect it with the earlier points, like in the quotation from philosophical grammar, and there's a few similar remarks in the in Wittgenstein's Nachlass. So those remarks help to understand 81, which is very complicated, but for now, maybe you can just, well, here is what I offer as an account. It has to do with those kinds of issues, and without comparing our objects of study in philosophy with models, simplifying things in that way. But the simplification is not the same as idealization in physics, where we later then bring back the factors that we took out of the picture. In philosophy, there is no completeness, complete account in the same sense. But like I said, it might be a naive picture of physics too. In fact, I think maybe Wittgenstein's account also works better for physics. This can be, I'll say this, I want to stop soon, but I want to connect it with these ideas, because I've been speaking very abstractly. I want to connect it with some remarks in the investigations, at the start of the investigations, for instance, the Augustinian picture of language. So Wittgenstein starts the investigations by talking about Augustine's picture of language, according to which every word is a name. And then his first language game is an example of a strange shopping situation, where I think the purpose of that first example of shopping, where somebody goes to the shop and I guess maybe a child goes to the shop and hands to the shopkeeper this slip of paper that says 5 red apples. And then in response to each of those words, the shopkeeper does something different. And this illustrates the difference of the use of those words. So 5, so what the shopkeeper does is they go to the drawer where they keep apples. So there's a sign, let's say, there's a sign that says apple, apple. Then he looks at the color chart. So the name apples is like a label. That's really a name. Then, but is the color red functioning as a name? Well, not really, because the shopkeeper is comparing it to a color chart, and then he takes those apples that correspond to the color red. So he's comparing for similarity something. Of course, you don't do that with names. You don't compare a name for similarity with its object. I mean, it makes no sense that the Finnish word tuoli for chair is more similar to chairs than the English word chair. Or karekla in Greek or whatever. Well, names are not similar to their objects. So what's going on with the color red, comparing it to a chart, it indicates something about the different use. And then 5, the shopkeeper takes from the drawer 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, correlates the apples with the numbers that he's quoting from his head. So it's like an invisible measuring rod. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Of course, that's not how you use names either. So the first language game in the investigation illustrates Wittgenstein's method, I think, very well. It brings out, in response to Augustine saying that every word is a name, the shopping example gives you examples of 3 different uses by illustrating how the shopkeeper acts in response to all of them. And when you see how he acts in response to all of them, you realize, oh, those words too have a very different use. But that model or that language game is a really nice example of a Wittgensteinian model in the sense that that shopping situation is completely unrealistic. I don't think that even in Cambridge in the 1930s, they shopped apples like that. I wasn't there, but I'm pretty sure they didn't go. The shopkeeper didn't look up a color chart and say, "Oh, red, okay." You could do that if you're decorating your home. Then, when you need to know the color exactly, that's what you do. So it is part of the use of those color samples is part of the use of colors. But Wittgenstein is exaggerating these differences in his example in order to bring out the differences of use of those words. And that's important. So these models clarificatory models don't have to be realistic. They might exaggerate, like Wittgenstein does in the shopping language game. He exaggerates those feelings. No shopkeeper will need to compare the red apples to a color chart in order to know which ones are red. So that's an exaggeration. But the exaggeration might be very helpful for philosophy in the same way that it brings out more clearly the features of the actual use of those words. So the language game is a bit like a caricature. If you want to draw a caricature of my face, then you exaggerate some features, like I got big ears, I got big nose. So you make those really big, and maybe you can bring out something characteristic about me. I mean, whatever is characteristic of me. But that's what you do when you draw a caricature of somebody's face. You exaggerate some features in order to bring out something characteristic of it. I think that's a good description of what goes on in the first language game in the philosophical investigations. Wittgenstein, it's like a caricature. Wittgenstein exaggerates the features of the use in order to bring out how they're different, that not all the uses are names. Then he goes on to ask, and this is kind of the point that I wanted to say and come back to this. So he then asks also about Augustine's picture. So he says this is so this is a quotation on page 2. Augustine, we might say, does describe a system of communication, only not everything that we call language is this system. And one has to say in this and several cases where the question arises, will this description do or not? The answer is yes, it will, but only for this narrowly circumscribed area, not for the whole that we're purporting to describe. It is as if someone were to say, playing a game consists of moving objects on a surface according to certain rule, and we replied, you seem to be thinking about board games, but they are not all the games that there are. You can, and this is really important, you can rectify your explanation by expressly restricting it to those games. This is important because I think that then Wittgenstein goes on and does exactly that. Because next language game is the builder's language game, where all the expressions are names. And Wittgenstein then goes on and uses that language game for specific clarificatory purposes, even though it is simplified. But rather than putting it forward as a thesis or a claim about language, like Augustine maybe did, Wittgenstein is only comparing language with that kind of simplified language game. So he's, like he says in the quotation, expressly restricting its use. He's comparing that language game with some cases, not all of them. And that's how you can limit the generality of the philosophical model by comparing it with the cases. And that allows you to say, okay, those cases don't fit it, those cases are exceptions. If you only compare your model with the actual reality, rather than putting it forward as a philosophical thesis, which all the cases must fit. If you don't do that, the dogmatic claim, but you only compare reality with your model for similarity and difference, then you can limit the use of your model for those cases that it can really clarify. So in that way, I think something really important is happening right at the start of the investigations. Wittgenstein says about the philosophical investigations that it introduces a method by examples. That's exactly what he's doing right at the start. He starts introducing through examples the method of language games, the method of using these simple examples of language use to clarify specific aspects of language use by comparing actual complicated uses of language with those simplified models. So I think it's really quite important for understanding Wittgenstein kind of how he starts, because the beginning of the investigations has been read in many different ways. Well, here is my take on it, but I think that it does help make sense of it. Wittgenstein is not rejecting the Augustinian account. He says it's simplified, but it's okay if you use that as a model for specific purposes, which he then does with the help of the builder's model. And let me note the last quotation in the handout. This is from 1939-1940, so when Wittgenstein had already completed the first versions of the investigations, and then he comments on the language game method. The advantage of the examination of language games is just that they let us see gradually what otherwise we only see as a whole, that is, as a tangled clue. So language use is really complicated, but you can have a simplified model that brings out some aspects of its use. Then you can start complicating that model gradually, like Wittgenstein in fact does in the investigations with the builder's example. He introduces, for instance, numerals into it, like the A, B, C, D. Bring me D slabs, so bring me like 4 slabs. And he uses that model where all the words are names, except later when he introduces the other word kinds into it. But in the beginning, it's just a language game where all the expressions are names. He uses that to clarify specific issues about language. For instance, issues such as that when the guy says slab, does it mean that he has to think in his head the complete sentence, bring me slab? And this kind of issues can be clarified with the help of this simplified model, because it captures everything that is relevant. And it doesn't matter that it is like the Augustinian account of language, which is simplified. that model can still do good work if it captures everything that is relevant for those discussions. And yes, it captures everything relevant if the question is, for instance, when the builder says slab, and they mean bring me a slab, does this mean that they have to somehow, in their head, there's a mental processing going on where they have the complete sentence of bring me a slab? And that's how slab acquires the meaning of, bring me a slab. And Wittgenstein says, no, we don't have to assume any such mental processes going on the background. The use is completed in itself. We can understand the use of slab for bring me the slab. But my point here is that even that kind of very simple language game, where the language game only consists of names, that can be helpfully used for philosophical investigations. And the important thing is that it captures whatever is relevant for addressing the issues that you use it to address. And then, it's really a different kind of aspect of the use of language games as models, that you add complexity gradually, because then you can still see how things work. If you articulate a model that is equally complex as your object of study, well, then the model is not going to help you to understand anything if it's as difficult to understand as the objects of study themselves. So that's why simplification is very important. We can understand something clearly, something simple we can understand clearly. When things get complicated, our understanding starts struggling. So simplification is important for that reason. But we can also mislead ourselves by simplifying if we then claim that things are simpler than they really are. But the important point here is that there's a big difference between saying, for certain purposes of a philosophical discussion, for addressing problems A, B, and C, we can treat language as a calculus, let's say. And so that's very, very different from saying language, putting forward the thesis, language really is a calculus. So in one case, we idealize for specific purposes of a philosophical discussion, we simplify in order to address specific issues. In the other case, when we claim that language really is a calculus, we're making a simplistic claim and we're falsifying things. Okay, so I think I've spent almost an hour, but I've also said everything that I wanted to say, so I should stop here. Maybe I should quickly explain why I brought in, because I read Moreno's one article from him, and when I was reading it, it struck me that he says that he is only doing philosophical therapy, or the purpose of what he says is philosophical therapy. I know too little of his work to know what exactly he says, but when I read the article, it seemed to me like language games were kind of used as a basis of developing a theory of language, that this is how meaning is constituted from activities, this is how meaning arises from activities, and that sounds to me, I might be wrong about the aims of Moreno, but if you look at them on first page of the quotation, an earlier version of remarks 130 and 131 from the investigations, there Wittgenstein says something that he's kind of he's saying that language games are not kind of the starting point of a theory. He says, when I describe certain simple language games, this is not in order to describe on their basis the processes of our actual developed language, which would only lead to injustices. And then Nichod and Russell mentioned as an example. Rather, we let the language game be what they are. They should only emanate or radiate their clarifying effect on our problems. So this is an early version of what I think this is an early version. It's very similar to what becomes Investigations 130 and 131, which says the language games are not the starting point of regimentation of language or a theory of language. Rather, they're objects of comparison. And that's an important point. So language games should not, according to Wittgenstein, be kind of turned into the basis of a philosophical theory, for instance, about how meanings are constituted and so on. Language games are a model with which actual language uses are compared, and in that way we can clarify aspects of actual use. Also, I suppose, how issues relating to meaning, but not in the sense of developing a theory of meaning. I think that's what the earlier version of that remark kind of pretty much explicitly excludes. So that was, maybe I'm wrong about Moreno, but that was my kind of reaction to reading his article, and it brought up this remark from Wittgenstein's Nahlas to my mind. And language games are not the basis of a theory in that sort of sense. But okay, I could stop here and then.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, we'd like to thank you very much for this very clarifying exposition. And I think we go to the questions, but I'll just make a very, very short remark on your last considerations. I think your position and Moreno's positions are much closer than your reading of Moreno. As you sent us the PDF, the quotations, I went to the comments that Moreno makes on the investigations of 131, 132. And the points that he raises there are, if not exactly the same, very close to what you're saying.
Okay.
So, okay, but I mean, it's not the place here to discuss here, because and the other point is Moreno is developing a philosophy of his own based on Wittgenstein. So he says Wittgenstein is making therapy, and he's clarifying. That's one difference of your account. You speak always of clarification. Moreno speaks of therapy of our confusions, but I mean, they're very similar concepts. But he wants to develop a theory, science theory, having therapy as a preparation for that, as a never being dogmatic. But this is a long discussion, and when the book is out, we might continue it. But we do have questions, so so please, we do have a question, Rafael. Ricardo Cassani raised his hand. Okay, I'll give the floor to Rafael, who will manage the questions. And if something is, I'll just try to be the background here and help.
Okay, thank you.
Sure, thanks, Paulo. Perhaps Ricardo Cavassani wants to pose his question aloud, yeah?
Yes. Thank you.
Please do.
So first of all, this is Ricardo speaking. Thank you very much, Professor. I'd like to thank you because your interpretation of Wittgenstein is very important to me. I've been working on it for quite a while, and I think it's the correct reading. So thank you for your work. What I want to ask you is, what I would like to ask is that I've seen some people saying that AI, large language models, use language, and that from the Wittgensteinian point of view, those models would understand meaning since meaning would be used. I think this is a very superficial reading of Wittgenstein. And I would like to know, what can you say about it? Do you think that Wittgenstein would agree that large language models are using language like we use? Thank you.
Thanks. That's an interesting question. I wrote recently about an article on Wittgenstein and artificial intelligence. There's a collection coming out soon about Wittgenstein and artificial intelligence. So I didn't address exactly this issue, but there are connections. I would say, so the large language models, well, what this kind of AI, which I think of as, well, some people say that it's a statistical plagiarism machine. I'm inclined to, so what those kinds of models do is that they calculate the likelihood of continuing the strings of signs. And to me, it seems very, very different from language use. It's just a sort of imitation of language use based on statistical regularities. That's how it seems to me. What those models are doing, it's incredible that they can imitate actual language use so well in that kind of way. But I'm a little bit skeptical about those things. In my paper, I talked about actually this problem about simplification without falsification in relation to AI, because that's very important. To be able to simplify without falsifying is really important for understanding what's important in a situation, and genuine artificial intelligence would have to be able to do something like that. And this is connected with the old problems about framing and so on. How does the artificial intelligence know what are the relevant situations when something changes in the situation? What is relevant in that situation? What are they going to do? I think there's various interesting things that come up in that connection, but so I'm skeptical about the idea that those models would be using language in some proper sense rather than just imitating uses of language on the basis of the statistics. So that's how I would answer that question.
Thank you.
So João Daniel, and then Paulo, and then Cristiane.
Oh, hi. Can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes. Go ahead.
Okay, so thank you very much for your talk. I'm curious about the thing that you mentioned, that you're writing a book on moral philosophy. So I was thinking about if this method of using language games as a caricature, the word that you use, or something like a simple version of language use. Is there a parallel to study moral philosophy? Obviously, Wittgenstein wrote that lecture on ethics. Is there something parallel to this, to study moral philosophy, like simple ethical examples to study more complex ethical phenomena?
Yes, and I think this illustrates an important point, because one thing, I speak about many things in the book, but one thing that I say is that, for instance, Kant and the utilitarian accounts of moral action. So according to Kant, morality always depends on the motive. And according to utilitarians or consequentialists, it depends on the consequences. And I think, and then the problem is that, if you put either of those claims forward as a thesis about what moral action always is, you end up in problems. There's exceptions, and you can't really account it for like that. And but I think both accounts capture something important about morality of actions. Both things, consequences and motives, can be relevant. That's just not always relevant, and not the only thing that is relevant. So, but if you interpret the Kantian account of moral action and the utilitarian account as a Wittgensteinian model with which you compare the actual cases, then that can help you to bring out something important about moral actions, and you can avoid the problems that arise for the dogmatic claims of the Kantian and utilitarian theory. So that's one thing that is going on in the book, that I'm proposing that we start making this kind of Wittgensteinian use of those theories. Because, I I'm not a big fan of utilitarianism, but I certainly have great respect for Kant. Nevertheless, I think this account is simplistic, but it captures something important, and the important thing that it captures can be saved by reinterpreting his theory as a Wittgensteinian model. So, and overall, the book is an attempt to do justice to the complexity of morality. I think morality is a really complicated thing by using Wittgensteinian models. So clarifying specific aspects rather than giving one theory that's supposed to explain everything and then ends up in kind of dogmatic simplification and so on. So that's the idea there. But the general thing about this is that I think it's possible to do this with various, maybe not all, but various traditional philosophical theories, to reinterpret them as Wittgensteinian models and then avoid some problems that arise if you put them forward as true or false thesis. Because if you put forward the Kantian account as a true thesis that explains every possible case, then it excludes every other account of moral actions. Only one theory can be correct, and that's why you have this kind of stalemate in moral theory between utilitarians and virtue ethicists and Kantians, and they're all there stuck. I don't think anybody of them is going to show that our theory is correct and all the rest are false. And so in order to be able to change the situation, to solve the stalemate and actually bring about collaboration, genuine collaboration in moral philosophy, I think it helps to reinterpret the accounts as Wittgensteinian models. So that's how I'm trying to apply Wittgenstein, because for me, the motivation for writing about Wittgenstein, the books that I've written, is to work out the method, but the purpose was always to apply it. And so now I'm trying to do that. At the age of 55, finally. It has taken a little while, but you know. So that's what I would say in response to that.
Okay, thank you very
Thanks
much
for the question.
Paulo.
My remark has to do with the first question about artificial intelligence, and does artificial intelligence really uses language? No, I agree that it just emulates language, and I think that the main problem, I work with translation theory. I'm developing a translation theory on the basis of a Wittgensteinian account of language. And I think the most important word here, aspect, is creativity. Artificial intelligence works on the basis of statistics and tries to emulate what would be in a normal situation. So everything that goes out of that not normal situation would not function. I've seen people, I've even tested many of those programs for automatic translations. They are a reality, they are useful, but creativity has to do with the moment where meaning changes, because the new situation demands a change in the meaning, how meaning expands itself. So meaning is not all static, and I think we can relate that what was said by Oskari here. So language is a fluctuating phenomenon. So meaning cannot be closed in like in a Saussurian kind of picture. So just to say, think of translation, and it won't account for everything. It won't account for what different cultures are. So what artificial intelligence can do in translation, for example, is to account for what's mainstream, what's the trend. But then we have a big problem here that what is different can be expelled from the system, and it won't work. But that's the point. Think of translation programs. It's not the same. It emulates real use because it cannot emulate creativity as they try to say that they emulate creativity. It's always afterwards. Okay, that's that. I wouldn't like to say much more than that. I don't know if you want to comment on this, but this is a kind of application of this thing. And creativity is the most important aspect here.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, I think I agree with everything in there, and I think that the creativity is very, very important, and the fact that the uses of language are kind of open-ended, and that creates the possibility for all kinds of new uses. I don't know what artificial intelligence would make of what Wittgenstein calls secondary uses. I suppose it couldn't really handle that. It would just treat it as some kind of nonsense. My favorite example of secondary use, and I think they're really important, is when Wayne Shorter says a piano player, he says to a piano player, put more water in the chords. And then the piano player spends a sleepless night in a hotel room thinking, oh, what does maestro mean? And then next day he tries to put more water in the chords, and Wayne Shorter says, good, but the water has to be clear. So this is how you communicate in kind of artistic context, and that is creative language use. I guess Wayne Shorter was known for this kind of weird ways of speaking, but this is in his autobiography, Footsteps or something. I think it's a really nice example of secondary uses. And yeah, I don't suppose artificial intelligence is anywhere near being able to do that kind of things, because you can't copy them. You know, you can't emulate them because they're new uses. So what are you going to emulate?
Cristiane?
Hello, thank you very much for your presentation. So on behalf of my research group, the Philosophy, Education, Language and Pragmatics, I would like to turn back to the issue of the artificial of AI, of the problem of simplification without falsification in AI, as presented in your text, but in particular the ChatGPT, because this app started to be used in academia by students and researchers to carry out their coursework and research. So it's a similar question to Paulo's question, because in addition to the question of choosing what is relevant, that must be kept in a simplification, and the other data discarded, and also taking into account the interests and purposes of the individual or an institution that's consulting the ChatGPT, as you rightly pointed out in your text, as being fundamental aspects to avoid falsification. Wouldn't there still be the ethical problem of generating non-authorial texts, not that it's texts that are not in fact an individual reflection? Now, wouldn't this kind of use of ChatGPT have harmful effects on the training of students and young researchers? Now, how to ensure the possibility of questioning, the development of a critical spirit, and the formation of the character of these young people? It could not be said that this type of simplification provided by this app, far beyond the question of true and false, exterminates the human features which cannot be programmed, calculated, features such as originality, creativity, as Paulo said, ethical behavior, inventiveness, seeing new aspects, ability to move through other language games that exist in our forms of life, and even imagine new language games which are not calculable. No? Anyway, wouldn't these artificial intelligence algorithms be much closer to the logic of the Tractatus, still linked to a referential conception of language and linked to an ideal of exactness expressed by the logical form of language, than to the logic investigation of PI? And another question that occurred to us when we read the conclusion of your text about simplification.
Just a
Yes.
moment. Isn't it better to let him comment your first question, then you come back again?
Okay.
Is that all right?
Yeah, they are close, the two questions, but it's okay. It's enough, the first one.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, I mean, first of all, you mentioned the notion of purpose. I think that's very, very important for the issue of how to simplify, because what counts an okay simplification depends on the purpose of what's going on. If I ask somebody to describe a room, what are they supposed to include in the description? Well, it depends on the purpose of the question, which is normally, I guess, humans in the context have an understanding of that. Like if I ask you, can you describe what's in the room, all the objects? Are they supposed to say that, okay, there's a bookcase and there's books in the bookcase? Or are they supposed to list all the books, or maybe all the pages on the books? Without knowing the purpose, you don't know what you're supposed to, how you're supposed to describe. So interest and purposes are really important in that sense. And I guess that's partly the problem with the ChatGPT, that it doesn't really have any purposes or interests. And actually, this is the sort of issues that I discuss in my article. So if you're interested in artificial intelligence there, then I'm happy to share my article. You know, if anybody emails me, then I'm happy to send it. It's now in the processing. I guess I'll see the proofs next or something. So it's already it's ready and done. So I'm happy to share it. Now about the problems for education. Yeah, I think those are very serious problems, and we haven't maybe even realized, oh, well, it sounded like you had thought about it a lot, but I think we're just starting to realize all the problems that come from it. And for instance, at my university, we now make declarations that if you use ChatGPT in your essay writing as an aid, well, first of all, don't rely on it, but then that they have to declare it, that they have to always check everything that it says, because it hallucinates, it comes up with things that don't exist, and so on. So, but I don't think that what we have in place is anywhere near a properly thought out relationship with ChatGPT. It's just a first reaction. Well, if you're going to use it, then say that you have used it and be careful. That's all it is. But yes, I think there's a risk that it is destructive for thinking if people rely on it. Maybe in the same way that, I mean, it's not the same thing. There are limits to this analogy, but the introduction of calculators. People are too lazy to do their calculations now, and they don't trust themselves as calculating right. And so maybe these abilities, or with mobile phones, nobody remembers phone numbers anymore, but we used to have lots of phone numbers in our heads. I still remember some phone numbers from my youth. I don't know any phone numbers of my friends now because they're all in the phone. So it kind of degenerates. We're losing abilities to remember phone numbers, to do the calculations in our heads. And then maybe with ChatGPT, something even worse. So I think you're right that there are big risks here. I'm less sure about how to address them. I guess artificial intelligence can be a good tool, but it's only a tool, and I think that's That's very important. Like in Finland, we have this proverb that says, "Fire is a good servant, but a bad master." Yeah, it is excellent servant, but a very bad master. Maybe the same goes for artificial intelligence. It might be an excellent tool, but when it starts, doing things on our behalf, we might be in trouble. So, yeah, many interesting questions.
The second part of the question, or the second question?
The second question has to do with your text about about simplification. Your conclusion in your text about simplification without falsification. You question whether the ability to revise ourselves would be possible for the AIs. And we in our group believe that for teaching to be critical and question dogmatism, it needs to propose thinking about the complex problems of society, including touching on its most delicate issues. So do you believe that in some way, in the long term, AIs may contribute in the negative way to the sedimentation of conservative thoughts, in the sense that students can become mere reproducers of the texts produced by AIs, thus avoiding the exercise of self-criticism that you mention in your text?
I think there is that kind of risk. And again, it's a new thing. It's hard to say when you're faced with new things, what exactly is going on, like in this case, but you have thought about these problems clearly more than I have. I agree that there's that kind of risk, and some ethical problems with this kind of statistical AI have been already noted, that it produces also all the prejudices like racism and whatever. It reproduces everything, every stupidity that anybody has ever put on the internet. The chat GP absorbs that, and it becomes part of what it says, because it can't see that, well, that's a stupid thing to say, because it doesn't understand really anything. It just copies and emulates and imitates things. So yeah, and for people, of course, to lose the ability to think for themselves, well, I think there's hardly anything more important than that capacity to think. So if we are going that way, then we're in trouble, I think.
I think so too. Okay, thank you very much.
Thanks. So I'm gonna read out a question that popped out in the chat, and then I'll suggest the yes. So Rafael Santos says, "Thank you for this talk. It seems your way of understanding the rule following discussion is very close to the way Stanley Cavell understands it, particularly in the sense that one should not try to communicate subjective states of mind, plights of mind, by appealing to rules. Instead, this communication would depend on a sense of community, which would be one possible outcome of philosophy. How do you see this point?" This is from Rafael Santos in the chat.
I think there probably are some similarities between the way that there are similarities between the way that I read Wittgenstein and the way that Cavell reads. I mean, I appreciate Cavell very much, although I don't spend a lot of time reading him. I'm not really certain how to answer this question, because I'm not sure what it is asking, or what's the purpose and where it wants to go. I think the rule following problem is an interesting and important issue, But there, I think it's really important to remember Wittgenstein's method of how to deal with it. And I think Cavell he has some sort of sense for it. He's somehow sensitive to Wittgenstein and Wittgenstein's appreciation of complexities. But I don't know what to say about it. I would point out, though, that I think it's noteworthy that when Wittgenstein starts discussing the rule-following problem in the investigations, he says, let's employ the method of remark 2. And then he comes up with the example of the pupil always adding 2. So that example is a simple language game. The picture or the example of the student always adding +2. That's a simple language game. And that is kind of carrying the discussion in. That's a really interesting use of the method of language games, in the sense that the simple example of the student or the pupil adding 2, that gives us a simple example of rule following. And it helps us to think about the complex issue of rule following, for instance, whether it's some sort of mental thing that goes on in the mind, when we focus on that kind of simple example. So I think that's another interesting use of the method of language games there. But so now I'm just kind of talking around the problem and not directly knowing what to address it. So I guess I'll just say this, and I hope that it helps somehow or is somehow relevant. I've just recently written, I don't want to keep mentioning these papers that I've recently written, but I have just written about rule following and there's another collection that is just coming out, edited by Kevin Cahill, where I criticize Kripke's account of rule following and try to connect it with what I think Wittgenstein actually wants to do, and it's a very different thing from what Kripke wants to do. So if somebody's interested in rule following, that might be of interest, because I think Wittgenstein's purpose when discussing the rule following is not to give an account of meaning or a theory of meaning or the constitution of meaning. Something else is going on. Although you can also learn something about meaning through the issue of rules, but to put it forward as a theory of meaning like Kripke, I think that only leads to problems. And yeah, I think Cavell is much more sensitive to Wittgenstein in various ways. But I don't know what else to say in response to this question now. I think.
May I just join very shortly? Is this in that collection about Kripke? Is that your paper in that collection that you?
No, that my paper in that collection is on the notion of contingent a priori.
Could you send us the reference to this Kripke paper? It interests me. So
the rule following thing.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay.
I only have the manuscript now because I think the proofs are coming soon, but I can definitely
send the reference so we can read it when it's out.
Okay.
Okay, thank you. I'll give it back to Rafael.
Thanks. So, José Estevam?
Good morning. I'm a student of Professor Christian and member of FELP group. I have two little questions. The first is, in your article on simplification without the falsification, you present two possible ways, abstract or idealize. When talking about the artificial intelligence in your article, do you present an abstraction or idealization of the notion of artificial intelligence? And the second question connects, as your article was published in 2023, what, if any, would be, in general terms, new problems that this topic of AI present to you? Thank you.
I'm not sure which article you're referring to. I've only written one paper about artificial intelligence.
Sorry. The simplification without falsification.
Okay.
You had the draft, I think, somewhere open in the internet, so people read it and discussed it.
Okay, so yeah, so I post things on Academia Edu. So
Yeah, that's it.
Okay. I'm still not sure how to go with this one, but nevertheless, well, I think in relation to AI, the problem with simplifying without falsifying is, like I was already saying, that to simplify without falsifying requires some sort of understanding of the interest or purpose behind doing that. Because so, or the notion of relevance. So I can simplify without falsifying if I say, give you a description of this room, and I include in the description everything that is relevant. But in order to be able to do that, I would have to understand what the purpose is that the description serves. And I think in human interaction, often when we ask somebody, oh, can you say what's going on in there? They're not going to explain everything that is going on somewhere, but they will say what is relevant. Or if I speak about my holiday to somebody, say I was just in a holiday, and then I meet somebody and I describe my holiday, for two different people, I might give a very different account of my holiday, because I know that one of them is interested in those things and the other one is interested in those other things. And both descriptions of my holiday might be completely true. There's nothing false. But I give a very different description of it because I assume that they have, the listener has certain interests, and that's how I adjust my explanation. And similarly, if I ask something from somebody, can you describe what's going on there? In order to be able to respond, they would have to understand the point, that, what my interest is, or what the purpose of the question is, or what the point of the question is. But then the problem with AI is that it doesn't know anything about the point or the purpose, and it has no interests. And this is, I mean, John Hogeland spoke about artificial intelligence having no purposes or interests by saying it doesn't give a damn. Nothing matters to it. But if nothing matters to you, well, then you have no purposes and you have no interest, and then anything could be relevant or nothing is relevant. So that's the problem with AI, that it does not have any purposes. Then anything or nothing is relevant, and that's not how the human mind works anyway. And if everything and nothing is relevant, then it's hard to make sense of anything. So I'm not really sure if I'm really addressing your question, Jose, but that is how I reacted.
Thanks. So I'm going to read out another question that's popped out in the chat section from Tauan Soares. He says, hello, Professor. Thanks for your talk today. Like Ricardo, I owe a lot to your work in my research, both during my master's and now in my doctoral studies. My question is related to methodology, specifically the idea of the Wittgensteinian philosopher as a grammatical investigator. There are important figures in anthropology and other fields who see Wittgenstein's philosophy as providing very useful tools for conducting the type of investigation that interests them. One example is Vina Dass's book, Textures of the Ordinary, recently translated into Portuguese. Do you think it is worth examining how they apply Wittgenstein in order to understand and improve our own methods of investigation? That's from Tawan Suarez in the chat.
Yeah, thank you. I don't know that book, so it's difficult to say anything specifically about that. I've heard the name, but that's all I know. So now I'm revealing my ignorance. But I think that it's very important for Wittgenstein that he saw himself as a logician. I think he saw himself as a logician through his whole career, except that logic in the later Wittgenstein becomes something that is still not recognized really as logic. So when people hear logic, they start thinking about mathematical logic and calculuses, and Wittgenstein goes far beyond that. And I think that's really interesting, whilst retaining the calculus part as a little, well, not maybe a little, but it's a part of logic, but not the whole of it. And so for Wittgenstein as a philosopher also, and not just as a logician, it's important that he's not simply making empirical observations. And I guess that's the main difference from anthropology, because they are doing anthropology is an empirical study of whatever is studied. And it is always important, I think, to keep in mind the difference of Wittgenstein, that he's not making empirical claims about language use, for instance. And in this respect, I think it's important that the necessity that philosophers, the exceptionless necessity that philosophical traditional thesis express in the later Wittgenstein is a feature of the model. So meaning is used, for instance, well, it just says meaning is used, or that an inner state requires an external criterion. I think that's a good example, because there are many inner states that don't require, and for which there aren't, like for pain, there is no external criterion. So that's a simplification. There's some sort of, say, physical longing for home that I might feel, and so I'm in that mental state. But there's no natural expression for that, or external expression, except for me looking a bit strange and maybe writing a poem or something. So the models express exceptionless generality and necessity, but then they can allow for exceptions because we only compare them with the actual cases, and then we can say, yes, it fits these cases, but not those ones. So that's different from making empirical claims about language, because an empirical claim, has to describe things accurately, or it's going to be false. Of course, you can do idealization in the case of empirical claims too, but then I think that, for instance, is a little bit different. So my point is that there are these different differences in the method in philosophy and logic and in the empirical studies. And they are very important, but I don't think that it follows from this difference that there is so the question is, do you think it's worth examining how they apply Wittgenstein in order to understand how to improve our own methods of investigation? Maybe. But I think they're doing a different investigation, and that's important to keep in mind. And the difference between, I always try to remind myself when I'm making claims about this and that, whether I'm because it's easy to fall into just making empirical claims about language use, for instance. But then the philosophical relevance of those kinds of claims is not very clear. So I think in doing philosophy, one has to be clear about what kind of claim one is making, and that empirical claims can be relevant for philosophy, certainly, but philosophical claims are not empirical claims. So there's some things to keep in mind, but I don't want to say that there isn't anything that one couldn't learn from that because it's an empirical study. I think there might be something to learn, but about Das's book, I don't actually know. The title sounds really nice and interesting. Maybe I should try to read it because I'm going to the summer house soon.
Sure. Yeah. No, sorry, go ahead.
I think that's what I can say in response to that. That might be useful, but philosophy is different from empirical studies. That's a very general answer. I don't know if that's useful, but
Sure.
Rafael, my question has a direct connection to that, I think.
Okay.
Okay? Could I? Oskari, in the section 6.4 of your 2019 book, you give 3 examples of may I read it or may I share the screen? Is that okay? Sharing the screen is okay? So with my annotations may be better, okay? So you can see what I'm talking about. Screen 2, I'll just share it, okay? Okay, just please okay. Consider the following remark on these issues. If humans were not in general agreed about the color of things, if undermined the case were not exceptional, then our concept of color could not exist. Then, no, our concept would not exist. Could you comment on that?
yeah, and actually this is, I discussed these points in response to Kripke's discussion of rule following, because I think they're relevant, because partly in that paper I'm arguing that Kripke is giving a kind of illusory explanation of meaning. So the difference between would, if things were different, then I mean, there's a traditional philosophical kind of claim, some sort of transcendental claim that says such and such has to be the case, otherwise we couldn't do so and so. But if one says that, as the could indicates that things being so and so is a condition for something, then I think that there's going on some sort of confusion between philosophical and scientific explanation, because in order to say that something is a condition for something, one has to have an independent understanding of both the condition and what it is a condition for. And if we don't understand, if we don't have a concept of what something would be a condition for, then it's kind of, the claim becomes empty. I'm not sure what to say, and this point is a very difficult one, I think. I mean, but I think so with the distinction between would and could, Wittgenstein is indicating, so the would kind of claims, those are descriptive. So if we did not agree in the use of color words, so I think it's, according to Wittgenstein, it is an essential characteristic of the use of color words that we agree. If I say that that's red, you know, we normally agree. I have had some disputes about colors, whether something is blue or dark blue or black. I think I was right, and that person couldn't see the difference. Who knows? But so normally we agree about colors. If we didn't agree, then we would not have the language games about colors that we now have. We would maybe have something different or nothing. But to say to present the agreement as a condition for the possibility of having the language schemes about color, then that creates a different situation that, and Wittgenstein rejects those kinds of claims. That I think it becomes some sort of pseudo explanation that we kind of imagine things being different, and we somehow try to present something being a condition for them being as they are. I'm not explaining this well. That's a good question, because this is a really difficult point to explain. I always struggle with this point. That is nicely sensed.
May I just add something to it? The reason I asked this.
Yeah.
There are two reasons. It seems that Wittgenstein is stating a thesis here. We would not. So it sounds like a thesis, but it's nice to hear that you're discussing with Kripke, and I really would like to read your paper on Kripke, because I don't think he's right. But the point is that we who worked with Professor Moreno, we got used to the idea of the transcendental, but not in the very traditional sense, Kantian sense, but in a new Kantian sense. Professor Moreno has a concept here. He says transcendental function. That some, I'll put this way: grammar has a transcendental function. Grammar, some things are necessary for the other to happen. But it's in a new Kantian way. It's not, he says, and this idea goes back to his teacher Granger, who says that neo-positivism substituted the Kantian transcendental subject with logic. So logic is transcendental. And I think that logic is still transcendental after the Tractatus, but in a different way. So just that you know the background of the question. Okay. So
that's interesting. I am kind of a fan of Kant, actually, and I spend a lot of time reading Kant. So some continental stuff that is very much influenced by Kant, like early Heidegger. But I think that considerations about the necessary conditions of possibility, those can be very important for philosophy. But if we just, again, make a claim that such and such is a necessary condition of possibility, then we are again at risk of ending up making a dogmatic thesis. Rather, the statement about, I think this problem can be avoided if we, again, reinterpret the statement about the necessary conditions of possibility as a model. So here is something that seems to be a necessary condition of possibility for such and such. So there's the account, and we use that account as a model and an object of comparison, and then we avoid the kind of dogmatism that arises for Kant, for instance, when he says, okay, and here are the pure concepts of understanding, and that's all there is. There are no other forms of judgment. So I think at that point, problem about dogmatism arises for Kant. I mean, he gets the judgment forms from the ancient logicians, but it's not very clear that the ancient logicians have a complete list of all forms of judgments, and that we can then just turn it into a transcendental account of what thinking is like, that these are the possible judgment forms, and that's it. But if we use that kind of account of necessary conditions of possibility as a model in Wittgenstein's sense, then we can avoid those problems. Again, I actually have no own paper on this, which I still think is okay, which is, this shows my interest in transcendental argumentation, because that's one of the first papers I wrote. It's published in 2008 or 2009, so it's now already kind of old. What I explained just now, that transcendental arguments risk dogmatism, but that risk can be avoided by going in the Wittgensteinian way. That's kind of what I argue in that article, if that's of interest to anybody, so it can be found there, like properly explained. So that's what I would say. But I do think that to speak about conditions of possibility, that's a very helpful type of clarification that can bring out something important. But then if it's put forward as a thesis, then it has the risk of dogmatism again, which Wittgenstein can help to avoid. So, yeah.
Rafa.
Oh, great. Yeah. If I could make some remarks myself, they're not really questions, but just cues for you to speak a little bit more on a couple of stuff. So correct me if I'm wrong, your conception of Wittgenstein's anti-dogmatism rests on this notion that not only Wittgenstein's movements of thought proceed by comparing individual language games through their intermediary links, twist and glidden, but his very conception of meaning as use is itself a comparative notion, meaning a notion working as an object of comparison with other conceptions of language. And so we as readers shouldn't posit this as an all-encompassing thesis. So this will be a remark, and a second closely related remark is this. So in your handout, you quote a passage from the TypeScript 228 that says, the advantage of the examination of language games is just that they let us see gradually what otherwise we only see as a whole, that is, as a tangled clue. How would you compare this with the idea that the method wants to achieve a perspicuous presentation of a region of language games, which is otherwise out of our grasp, without the Wittgensteinian grammatical description?
Thanks. Those are both quite interesting things. I would say about meaning as use, just quickly, that when we think about meaning as use, I think it always has to also be specified what kind of use we're talking about. It could be rule-governed use. And then the model becomes much more specific. And I think in that case, it's clear that it doesn't capture all instances of language use, that there's more things going on. And Wittgenstein himself talks about onomatopoetic uses, for instance, that they are based on similarity. And he says those are iconic, that, like, you know, when I make a similar sound and that something else is making, then there's a perception of similarity between the word and that. And of course, a name, like I said earlier, that's not how names work. The word chair is not similar to the object in any way, but an onomatopoeic word imitates, you know, whatever it's talking about. So that's a very different way that those words function. And so when we think about meaning as use, we also have to specify what sort of use exactly are we talking about, and they're very different kinds of uses. So that's one point, which makes it important to think of meaning as use as a model. Sorry, can you remind me about the second point? I had something in mind.
I read out the quotes you make in your handout of TS TypeScript 228.
Yeah, I remember now.
Yeah.
Okay, so like I was saying in my talk, I think it's really a really good example of Wittgenstein doing exactly what that remark describes, is when he starts adding things into the builders' language games early on in the investigations. Like he introduces numerals, he introduces all kinds of new expressions into it. And the thing is, and I think there's a really interesting point here behind this, that so if we can keep things clear to us by kind of gradually adding those complexities, and it can help you to kind of keep separate things separate. If you say, okay, so first they just say slab and beam and like the builders language came, and that's all they do, and then gradually you start adding other things to it. When you add those other uses of language there, gradually you can still keep track of how everything is working. That building complexity kind of gradually helps to keep track of how things are working. There's like then kind of many layers of complexity, and that helps to keep track of it. So I think that it helps to create, adding complexity gradually helps to achieve and retain perspicuity in that kind of way. Because if I present you with something really complicated all at once, then you're like, oh, well, how am I going to make sense of that? But if I say something simpler first and then start gradually complicating, you can keep track of that and you can understand it. So that's why I think it's important. But I think that brings up a really interesting point about how human understanding is kind of works as a process, or it works in time. The issue that I can add complexity gradually, and then I can also remember them, and I can still keep the things separate. And now I can look at the complicated whole, and I can still keep track of the different things because they were introduced gradually. I think that's really interesting about how the human mind works. Also, how what sort of things help us to understand things and keep things clear, or what does perspicuity require? Because I think we can really say that it helps to keep things clear and perspicuous when the complexity is added gradually. Everything remains clear, rather than just everything throwing everything at you all at once. Then you're like, oh. So yeah, I guess that's what I would say. But I think that's a really interesting issue, because this processual character of philosophical understanding, that's not mentioned in any of the philosophy books that I remember reading, like that that our minds work in time, and then we can actually exploit that. Because I think it's really interesting also the Wittgenstein's different kinds of modes of representation. And maybe he was inspired by Frege, in the sense that if you look at Frege's logical language, when he presents a judgment kind of in 3 dimensions, so that it's all over the page, and it goes this way and it goes that way and it goes this way, and you can represent the logical relations of a judgment by kind of drawing it on the page. It's really interesting. I find it really interesting that you can, how having a particular kind of mode of representation can really help to think something clearly. But then, so Frege gives an explanation, and the logical languages are an explanation of how your mode of representing things can make all the difference. That if you say the sentence of an everyday language, we don't know what's going on in logically, but if you say it in the logical language, then we can see the logical relations, and oh, wow. And that was only all about representing it differently. But then it goes further. There's also a temporal dimension to this, like that if I do something gradually, then you can still keep track of it. And that can help, like a temporal mode of understanding can help our philosophical understanding too. I think that's kind of fascinating, and not a lot of traditional philosophy talks about that kind of thing, or at least I don't know where they would talk about it. But I find this really interesting. The logical positivists were interested in different kinds of modes of representation, like Neurath developed developed all these things that we are quite familiar with, how to present statistical facts that, you draw a small man, and this is how many of the population are unemployed. And then there's a big man next to it, and this is how many people are in employment or whatever. I just made up that example. And those kinds of modes of representation have now become standard. But I think it's fascinating how representing things in one way, and you go, oh yeah, everything is clear, and you represent it in another way, and it's very hard to understand what's going on. And so partly I'm very interested in Wittgenstein's different kinds of modes of representation in this way, and this processual character of building complexity. For that reason, I find really, really interesting. Or maybe this is how all the philosophy books always work. They start from somewhere and they add complexity gradually. And when you're at the end of the book, you're like, oh, now my head is full, but I can still keep track of the argument. I don't know. So maybe I'm just blind to what's there everywhere. So that's what I would respond.
No, thank you. That's very interesting. There's a question in the chat.
The person
put in
has left
Portuguese.
the room.
Huh?
The person has left the room, I think.
No, Marcondes Carvalho.
Is he?
Marcondes Carvalho isn't there?
Okay.
No, he's there. He's there.
Oh, he's there. Perfect. I'm sorry for the intervention. Just go ahead.
So he says in Portuguese, I'm going to translate. He says he congratulates you on your communication. He says Anscombe says that the philosopher is a maker of needs. So he fabricates needs, necessities. I don't think. I'm not sure which meaning he means. Needs or necessities. In the sense in which Professor Kuusela spoke, clarification can be understood as a thinking tool to demonstrate how claim theories in philosophy ignore the particularities of different uses of language, such as the Augustinian image of language. In other words, clarification with the aim of avoiding philosophical thesis aims to draw our attention to many interesting questions which an essentialist answer would block. So this is a question.
I think that's the important thing basically about the use of Wittgensteinian models, that they enable us to acknowledge the complexities of things. Like I think the example about Kantian and consequentialist accounts of moral judgments is a good example. If you put those theses forward as theses, I don't think you can really understand what moral judgments are like, or only some of them. But if you don't put them forward as theses, but just as models that help to bring into focus some aspects of the cases, then I think they're really they are actually quite helpful and important. So in that sense, if we make claims about essences, then yes, we are at risk of excluding from our view or what we can say all kinds of complexities. I think the Kantian account of moral judgments, for instance, does exclude all kinds of interesting complexities, because morality of an action might also depend on the way that or moral value might also depend on, for instance, the way that some action is done. It's not just about doing something, it's also about the way that something is done. That makes can make a moral difference too. But these kinds of complexities disappear from the Kantian view. Philosophical theory can make a person blind. They are very, very interesting and they can be very helpful for understanding something. But if one only looks at things from the light of a specific theory, then one can become blind. I think one, that's often to be seen in philosophy. So, in a way, philosophers could be manufacturers of necessities if those necessities are features of their models. And we use those models as instruments rather than making claims about how things really are. I still think that the aim is to understand how things are. So I don't read Wittgenstein as some kind of idealist or constructivist. What we construct is our models, and then we use those to try to understand the actual reality, which can be really complicated and it's not in our control. Our means of thought are in our control. We can build these models and we can simplify and help ourselves to understand things in that way. But reality is what it is, and true, the way that things are, what is true is, well, the way it is. But we can try to understand what is true and what is the case by employing all these modes of representing things and try to make things understandable for ourselves. I guess that's my response to that question, if I understood the drift of it in the right way.
Sure. Paulo?
Yeah, I don't want to abuse your time, but I want to bring something. I've said that your way of treating the questions or your reading of Wittgenstein is very close to the one we have here, and now I would like to bring up a difference. So we have both things, similarities and dissimilarities. From your book and from your talk, I have the impression that you understand a rule as not only as exact, you always speak about exact rules, but as something that is defined a priori. And you correct me if I say something wrong, Rafael and Cristiane. As we understand grammar, we can describe grammar using a term by Alain Moreno, which he has from Granger, a parte post. That means we make a description of the use and we try to understand which rule was underlying this use. So this would be an a parte post description. It means this rule was there, but we can only describe it after the deed. And indeed, there are some references. I don't know if it's on uncertainty. Wittgenstein somewhere says we make statements, we do things, and only afterwards we have a grasp of their life. So just you may comment on this if you want, but I mean, we must not. If we could also understand rule as something different, a rule as something that was there, and we described it, and I think grammar would be an example of this. Which grammar, and if we do that, we can subsume under the idea, under the concept of rule, or a rule that is context sensitive, that is sensitive to the circumstances of what is being, and this would explain or help us to understand how meaning changes, the dynamics of language. So rule doesn't have necessarily to be those exact rules of traditional philosophy or of linguistics, but rule is something that is always changing, adapting, and yet, despite of this adaptation, it is still a rule, because it's something that goes in regular, we can read out patterns out of those. Just for so you understand what when we use the same words, we might not be using the same concepts. So you can comment on that or just let it be. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. There wasn't anything that I thought, oh, that's very different. I'm not a big fan of the term a priori myself. I guess because in Kant, it's a special category of knowledge, and knowledge that is independent of experience, and Wittgenstein is critical of that notion. I guess I'm following the master. Being unhappy with the a priori being some sort of category of knowledge, and so I usually actually avoid using the notion of a priori. And my kind of outlook about this is now it gets risky because I'm now trying to say something very general, which I haven't really thought except privately. But the way that I see it, there's the empirical world. It is what it is. And then there is us who are trying to understand what's going on there. And for that purpose, we can come up with rules. We can come up with various kinds of things to try to understand what's going on. But these are our constructions. And in language, we have all kinds of regularities. I think they're very complicated, so it's very hard to state a rule that actually captures how language actually works. Even bachelors are unmarried men, even that doesn't work, because I mean, a priest is unmarried, but the priest is not a bachelor. A bachelor is somebody who might get married, but a priest has decided, well, a Catholic priest anyway, has decided not to. So even that simple notion is very hard to define. And so that again brings out the importance that when we try to describe uses of language, given their complexity, we run the risk of falsification if we kind of impose our rules on language and say, this is how it really works. And in that sense, so I wouldn't think of the rules as a priori. They are our tools for trying to understand something. And language has regularities that we can articulate in terms of statements of rules. Yeah, I don't know what else to say.
I would like to ask to add something, but not as a question. I've already told you I like very much the way you describe language as a family resemblance concept. Could you say a couple words about that? Because that's one problem when we talk about language, as if they were language. And I really, and I think it's PI 34 that when he's discussing family resemblance, those different things, and they have also similarities and dissimilarities, and that's the reason we call them all languages. But you make a use of that, and you say, you state very clearly, language is a family resemblance concept. Could you elaborate a little bit on that for people who haven't read this, if you feel comfortable about this?
Okay, actually, I wouldn't say kind of in a way that would be a thesis that language is the family.
Yes, okay.
I think family resemblance is a mode of conceptual unity, mode of accounting for conceptual unity. There are different kinds of conceptual unities, and family resemblance is one model of them. And yeah, I guess overall it's helpful to think of language as having that kind of unity. But like as illustrated by Wittgenstein's example of mathematics when he introduces the notion of family resemblance. So in mathematics, there might be many different kinds of numbers. And so Wittgenstein says, okay, and we might add new to it on the basis of the similarity, and so mathematics kind of constitutes a family. But in mathematics, all of those different types of numbers, all of them individually have actually precise definitions. So in that sense, saying that the whole is a family doesn't mean that you couldn't have good definitions of the members of the family. I think mathematics is an interesting example. I don't know much mathematics, and I don't know how the different kinds of numbers are defined, but they have clear definitions. That's much I do remember from school. But yeah, so the case is the ways that language functions are very different, and also different concepts have different kinds of unities. Like I find it very interesting what Wittgenstein says about psychological concepts, that they have this the first person perspective, and then there's also the third person use. And that's also a complex unity in the sense that if I say that I see Raphael, or I see a picture of Raphael, okay, I'm expressing seeing. That's a first person use. Or I see somebody on the street, that's a better example. Oh, Frank is there. But then if you're walking next to me on the street and you say, Oskari saw Frank, if you don't talk about the same state of seeing than I do, then I can't ask anybody, for instance, our epistemic practices are ruined. Like then I can't ask anybody to check what I see. Oh, I think Frank is there. Can you see him too? So when you talk about from the third person perspective about my seeing, you better talk about the same seeing as I talk about in a different way from my perspective, because otherwise you can't confirm what I see, and we're again in trouble. So that's a very interesting example of another complex unity of a concept. And so if language has all these kind of, because names don't have that kind of perspective, but psychological terms do have those kinds of complicated unity. And so if you start thinking about what kind of members that family of language has, there are really different and very interesting examples there, and they're far from being, for instance, just names, like philosophers have assumed. Names don't have this first and third person perspective to begin with. Chair is a chair, and that's it. Well, maybe it has to do with the fact that the chairs never say, hey, there's no first person perspective there. And when we talk about dogs or animals, okay, we talk about them from the third person perspective. They give some sort of expressions from the first person perspective. If you step on the leg, foot of a dog, the dog will make a sound and step away. So that's an expression of pain. But dog can never describe their pain. So they have something that is similar to us. They have the expression, and then we can talk about them from the third person perspective, but the dog can't describe themselves. So there's something missing there that we have. So they have something similar, but it's also simpler than we have. So I think these different kinds of concepts and conceptual complexity, that's a really interesting thing, and this whole family. And yeah, we'll lose all of that from sight if we just think there are names and then there are propositions. And yet, for some purposes, that simplified description of language, that there are just names and propositions, that might be okay for certain limited purposes of discussion. So that's not false either, whether the account is false or not. And that was part of my point when I brought up the quote about Augustine, that if Wittgenstein says, is this, where is it? Well, basically he says, is Augustine's description of language usable or not? Well, it depends on the purpose. So even the simple account of languages consisting of names and propositions, that can still have some limited uses, and that's sometimes all you need. We don't always need to bring in all the complexities, and that's important too. I don't know if this kind of answered anything that you had in mind, but
It helps. It helps. Rafa, it seems you don't have any questions. No more questions. We are ahead of time. We've said 2 hours, maybe extend a little bit, but I don't know. We don't want to abuse your time. So would it be the time to stop here? Would
I guess
anyone
so.
like
We should
to
wrap
make
up.
any more comments? Rafael, você quer comentar?
No, I think 2.5 hours is okay. So let's not abuse Oskari's time.
Oh, thank you. I'm actually getting hungry, so next thing I'm gonna do is cook.
Yes, okay. So thank you very, very much. It was very interesting for us. It's good to have to talk to the author. We don't always have this opportunity. And as you've seen, heard, people read your books here, people discuss your thesis, sometimes with agreement or with some kind of disagreement, which is also important. So wish you a good work on, and you seem to be working on a lot of things. So let's hope some of them maybe get translated into Portuguese, but people are reading them in English also. But I don't think, you don't write in Finnish, do you?
I haven't in many years. There's not enough time, really. I would like to actually, but time is limited.
Just a comment on that. I was last week in a conference, we have a working group on translation and philosophy, and we read and we heard and discussed a very interesting paper about the importance of philosophy being done in different languages, because English has become the Esperanto of philosophy. It looks like as if philosophy has to be written and thought in English in order to be philosophy. So this was a very important discussion, but I don't know, Finnish might be even more difficult to be read as Portuguese, or less people reading Finnish. So anyhow, thank you very much for being with us.
Thank you. I mean, I've really enjoyed a lot this session. So thank you very much for organizing it and asking me. I'm very happy to do something similar again in the future. You know, if you want me to. It was really enjoyable and interesting questions. And Finnish is a very precise language. It's very complicated, but that makes it also very precise. And it's well ordered. You don't get the confusion about, like in English, you know, meaning is the same for, I don't know how it's in Portuguese, but in German it's like there's a different word for intending, like I meant this and that, and then having meaning, like kind of a word has a meaning and then somebody means something by it. In English you get confused because it's just one word, but in German, in Finnish, and I don't know, maybe Portuguese, yeah, better to be more precise.
So I will stop the recording here. Yes. And okay, stop the recording.